Ronald DeFeo Jr. On the 13th of November, 1974, a young man burst into a bar in the town of Amityville on Long Island, shouting that someone had harmed his parents. Neighbors followed him back to the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, and what they found inside would go on to inspire one of the most famous horror franchises in American history. 6 members of the DeFeo family were gone, lost inside a single home in the middle of the night. But the most unsettling detail about that scene was not what had happened inside the house. It was the person standing in the doorway, pleading for help. Ronald DeFeo Jr., known to family and friends as Butch, was 23 years old. He worked at his grandfather's Buick dealership in Brooklyn, a job arranged by his father to keep him close and, ideally, out of trouble. Butch had grown up in the sprawling Dutch colonial home on Ocean Avenue, a 5-bedroom house with a boathouse and a swimming pool that his parents had bought at the height of the family's prosperity. To outsiders, the DeFeos looked like a large, comfortable Long Island household. Ronald, Sir, and Louise were both 43 years old. Their 4 other children lived at home. Behind the front door, the family had a troubled history, marked by disputes over money, discipline, and the growing instability of their oldest son. The events at 112 Ocean Avenue took place in the early hours of the 13th of November, 1974. Ronald Sr., Louise, and their 4 other children were all in the house at the time. A .35 caliber Marlin rifle owned by Butch was used inside the home. All 6 family members were harmed fatally in their bedrooms. The scene, when it was later discovered, showed no signs that anyone had risen from their beds, a detail that would trouble investigators for years afterward. That evening, Butch DeFeo drove into a local bar called Henry's and asked patrons for help. He told them someone had harmed his parents. A small group followed him back to the house and confirmed what he described. Police were called. Within hours, the surviving DeFeo's son was the only remaining occupant of the home. At first, DeFeo suggested that a mob hit was responsible, floating the theory that a hitman with ties to organized crime had targeted his father. Detectives were skeptical from the start. There were no signs of forced entry. The rifle used inside the home was one Butch was known to own, and DeFeo's demeanor in the hours after the discovery seemed inconsistent with someone who had just lost his entire family. Under questioning the next day, he changed his story. He admitted that he had been the one inside the house that night. In one widely reported statement, he told investigators that once he had started, he simply could not stop. The admission did not answer every question. Investigators struggled to explain how 6 people, spread across separate rooms on 2 floors, could have remained where they were without any of them apparently waking. DeFeo would later claim he heard voices telling him to do what he did, a claim that would form the basis of his legal defense. So what really happened inside that house on Ocean Avenue? The trial began in October of 1975. DeFeo's attorney, William Weber, pursued an insanity defense, arguing that his client had been in the middle of a psychotic break at the time of the events. The prosecution rejected that framing and presented DeFeo as a young man, motivated by resentment toward his father and, according to some theories introduced at trial, by a desire to gain access to family money and life insurance proceeds. On the 21st of November, 1975, the jury returned its verdict. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder, 1 for each family member. The judge sentenced him to 6 concurrent terms of 25 years to life in a New York State prison. Over the decades that followed, DeFeo attempted several appeals and applied multiple times for parole. Each application was denied. He gave a series of interviews from prison, in which his account of that November night shifted repeatedly. In some interviews, He continued to insist he had acted alone. In others, he suggested his sister Dawn had been involved and that he had covered for her. Investigators and prosecutors dismissed the newer versions. Just over a year after the events, a family named Lutz moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. They stayed for 28 days before leaving, and their claims of paranormal experiences inside the home became the basis for the book and film series known as the Amityville Horror. Historians, investigators, and members of the DeFeo family have long disputed the Lutz account, and the paranormal narrative has largely been dismissed as fabricated. The DeFeo case itself, however, remains firmly documented in court records. As of the writing of this account, Ronald DeFeo Jr. is deceased. He passed away on the 12th of March, 2021, at the age of 69, at Albany Medical Center after being transferred from Sullivan Correctional Facility. His true motive and the full sequence of what unfolded that night remains a matter of ongoing debate. The DeFeo case was, at least, discovered within hours. The case that comes next unfolded in a suburban Illinois home, where the man responsible spent months laying his groundwork long before anyone realized what was coming. Chris Coleman. There is a particular kind of unease that comes from watching a man plead publicly for the safe return of a family he has already lost by his own hand. Chris Coleman was a former Marine, a security chief for one of the largest televangelist organizations in the United States, and the son of a pastor. On the 5th of May, 2009, he stood in front of cameras and asked the public for help. The story he told was of an anonymous stalker who had been threatening the family for months. Investigators would find, within days, that the person behind the threats and the person delivering that emotional plea were the same man. Coleman worked as director of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, a Missouri-based organization whose founder was one of the most prominent televangelists in the country. The role paid roughly $100,000 a year and required a public presence, since he traveled with Meyer and appeared at events around the world. His wife Sherry was 31 years old. Their 2 sons lived with the family in the small town of Columbia, Illinois. To their neighbors and to Coleman's employer, the family appeared devoted to faith and to one another. The reality behind the door was different. Coleman had been having an affair for months with one of Sherry's own friends, a woman named Tara Lintz. Divorce, in the context of his employment, was not a straightforward option. Joyce Meyer Ministries expected its senior staff to model a certain kind of family life. Sherry had reportedly confided to a close friend that if anything ever happened to her husband would be the first person to look at. Beginning months before the events of May, Coleman began sending threatening messages to himself, to Sherry, and to Joyce Meyer, all of them designed to point toward a phantom outside enemy. The messages included spray-painted warnings inside the family home and typed notes that would later be turned over to investigators. Colleagues at the ministry were told the family was under active threat. Coleman positioned himself as a devoted father, protecting his household from an unseen figure. In reality, prosecutors would later argue, he was constructing the narrative he intended to use to explain what he was about to do. On the 5th of May, 2009, Coleman told investigators that he had left the family home in the pre-dawn hours to go to a local gym. When he returned, he called 911 to report finding his wife and both sons unresponsive in their bedrooms. All 3 had passed by asphyxiation. Coleman's account began to break apart almost immediately. The threatening messages, when analyzed, matched writing patterns and typographic details consistent with materials found on his own computer. Digital records showed searches and communications between Coleman and Lintz that undercut his claim of a stable marriage under external threat. Camera footage in and around the home did not support the timeline he had given, and no evidence pointed to anyone entering or leaving the home during the hours he claimed to have been at the gym. The theory presented at trial was straightforward. Coleman wanted to be with Lintz, but he could not risk the professional and financial consequences of a divorce. By his own admission to friends, Joyce Meyer Ministries would likely dismiss him if he ended the marriage. So rather than pursue the ordinary path, he chose to end his family, then stage the scene to point away from himself. What kind of man builds an imaginary enemy for months, then hides behind that same enemy while his own household is inside the same walls? The case went to trial in the spring of 2011. Prosecutors laid out the digital evidence, the pattern of forged threats, the affair, and the financial motive. Tara Lintz testified. Colleagues from Joyce Meyer Ministries testified about the phantom stalker narrative Coleman had built over months. Coleman's own family members, including his brother and father, appeared in court, some in support and some as reluctant witnesses to the picture that had emerged. On the 5th of May, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day after the offenses, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 3 counts of first-degree murder. By the time of sentencing, Illinois had abolished the death penalty. Judge Milton Wharton imposed 3 sentences of natural life in prison to be served without any possibility of parole. In his remarks from the bench, the judge described the case as one of the most calculated he had presided over. Coleman's direct appeal was rejected by an Illinois appellate court. The Illinois Supreme Court declined to hear further review. In interviews from prison, Coleman has continued to insist he is innocent. He has given multiple accounts in which he restates the stalker theory that failed at trial. No court has revisited the case on its merits since the appellate ruling. Sherry Coleman's family remained deeply involved in the aftermath, speaking publicly about the impact on her extended family and pressing for continued attention to the case. The Joyce Meyer organization, which had once employed Coleman, cut ties with him following the arrest. As of the writing of this account, Christopher Coleman is incarcerated in the Illinois state prison system, serving 3 sentences of natural life without the possibility of parole. He continues to publicly maintain his innocence. His appeals have been exhausted. In the Coleman case, the man responsible built his cover story in advance and stood in front of cameras to sell it. The next name on this list went further. He did not just try to explain away a disappearance. He tried to disappear himself, taking on the identity of a stranger and running to another country to start a life he could not lead at home. Christian Longo. There are cases where the person responsible runs, and there are cases where the person responsible tries to become someone else entirely. In December of 2001, Christian Longo did both. His wife and 3 children had vanished from the coast of Oregon. By the time investigators understood what had happened, Longo was on a beach in Mexico, drinking with strangers, using the name of a New York Times journalist he had never met. The reporter, Michael Finkel, would later travel to meet him in prison, and the strange relationship between the 2 men would become the basis for a book and a film. Underneath all of that was a family of 4 whose lives ended in a small Oregon town, while Longo was already planning his exit. Christian Longo had spent most of his adult life running from his own decisions. He had grown up in Michigan, married young, and become a father. His wife, Mary Jane, was 34 years old at the time of the events. On paper, the family looked like a young household making its way through ordinary struggles. In reality, Longo was moving from state to state ahead of debts, forgery accusations, and unpaid bills. He had passed bad checks, taken out fraudulent lines of credit, and burned through money he did not have. By the fall of 2001, the family had ended up on the Oregon coast, living in a rental condominium near the town of Newport. Longo had been fired from a job for stealing. Rent was overdue. The scale of his financial deception was closing in on him, and Mary Jane was beginning to understand it. Between the 16th and 18th of December 2001, all 4 other members of the family lost their lives inside and around that rental condominium. Investigators would later determine that Mary Jane and the youngest of the 3 were placed in the waters of a nearby marina. The 2 older children were placed in the tidal waters of a slough further south. Longo left the condominium and left the state. A local resident on the water discovered the first suitcase on the 19th of December 2001. Within days, investigators had connected the discovery to the missing Longo family. By the time authorities were looking for him, Longo was already gone. He had traveled to Mexico. In Cancun, and later in the coastal town of Tulum, he introduced himself to travelers, hostel staff, and other tourists as Michael Finkel, a journalist for the New York Times. The real Michael Finkel had recently been fired from the Times, a fact Longo appeared to be unaware of. Longo gave casual interviews about writing, discussed a book he was working on, and lived openly under the assumed name. The FBI added Longo to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. A tip from someone who had met him in a Tulum hostel gave investigators his location. On the 13th of January, 2002, Mexican authorities arrested him and returned him to Oregon. How does a man sit on a beach in Mexico, using another man's name, less than a month after the loss of his own family? Longo was tried in Lincoln County, Oregon, in the spring of 2003. At trial, he attempted to place responsibility on Mary Jane. He argued that she had been responsible for 2 of the losses in a moment of despair, and that he had reacted only afterward. Prosecutors rejected the story. The jury did as well. In April of 2003, he was convicted on 4 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Longo would not remain under a death sentence indefinitely. In a set of interviews and written statements from prison, he later admitted that his trial testimony had been false and that he had been responsible for all 4 losses. He became a public advocate for organ donation among condemned prisoners and wrote publicly about a program he called Gifts of Anatomical Value from Everyone. Michael Finkel, the reporter whose name Longo had borrowed, began exchanging letters with him in prison. That correspondence produced a memoir called True Story, and later a film adaptation of the same name. The relationship between the 2 men, and the questions of manipulation and self-invention running through it, became a case study in how readily some individuals reshape their own stories. On the 13th of December, 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown announced the commutation of every death sentence in the state, calling the death penalty dysfunctional and immoral. That commutation took effect the following day. Longo's death sentence was converted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of the writing of this account, he is held at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. Longo tried to disappear behind another man's name and another country's border. What follows is different. The man at the center did not run at all. He stood in his own driveway in front of television cameras and asked the country to help him find the wife and children he had already put beyond finding. Chris Watts. There is footage from the summer of 2018 that has been watched millions of times online. A man stands in front of his home in a suburb of Denver, speaking to a local news crew, asking his wife and daughters to come home. His voice is calm. His eyes move around a little too much. His hands never quite settle. Behind that footage, investigators already had questions, and within days those questions would become certainties. Chris Watts had reported his family missing on the morning of the 13th of August. By the time the interview aired, He had already given them a location most searchers would never think to look. Chris Watts was 33 years old, an oil field operator with a young family in Frederick, Colorado. His wife, Shanann, was 34, a saleswoman for a multi-level marketing health products company, and she was around 15 weeks pregnant with the couple's third child, a son who was to be named Nico. Their 2 daughters lived at home. To Shanann's co-workers and social media followers, the family projected a bright picture, built around long captions, family photos, and the milestones of a growing household. Away from the online presentation, the household was under strain. The couple had filed for bankruptcy in previous years and remained under financial pressure. Chris Watts had begun a relationship with a co-worker named Nickel Kessinger, who did not know he was married when the affair began. Kessinger would later cooperate fully with investigators and give a lengthy interview to the FBI. Shanann had returned home in the early hours of the 13th of August, 2018, from a business trip. Within a few hours of her arrival, she and her daughters were gone from the home. That morning, Chris Watts called Shanann's friend and told her that his wife was not answering her phone and that her car and purse were still at the house. The friend called police. When officers arrived, Watts appeared cooperative. He walked them through the home, showed them the girls' bedrooms, and helped them file a missing persons report. Over the following 2 days, he gave a series of media interviews from his front porch. He asked publicly for Shanann and the girls to come home. He said the house felt empty. Investigators, meanwhile, had begun reviewing a neighbor's security footage that showed Watts backing his truck up to the garage in the early morning hours, behavior he had no explanation for. Under continued questioning, Watts failed a polygraph examination. He then agreed to speak with investigators on the condition that his father be present. In that interview, he began by placing responsibility on Shanann for the loss of the girls. Investigators immediately identified inconsistencies in that account and pressed him further. By the end of the day, he had led investigators to an Anadarko Petroleum Works site where he had been employed. All 3 were recovered from that site. How does a man stand in his own driveway, speaking to cameras, while everyone he was supposed to protect is already at a work site he drove past on the way home? There would be no trial. On the 6th of November, 2018, Watts entered a guilty plea in a Weld County courtroom. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of pregnancy, and tampering with deceased human remains. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors withdrew the possibility of the death penalty at the specific request of Shanann's parents. On the 19th of November, 2018, Judge Marcelo Kopkow imposed the sentence. Watts received 3 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also received an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of pregnancy count and 36 years across the tampering counts. In court, Judge Kopkow described the case as one of the most inhumane and vicious he had ever presided over. A civil judgment followed. In November of 2019, Weld County Judge Todd Taylor entered a $6 million civil judgment against Watts, awarded to Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandy Razuchek. The judgment allocated $1 million for each of the losses and an additional $3 million in emotional damages, with interest accruing at 8% annually. Watts was later transferred out of Colorado for safety reasons. As of the writing of this account, he is held at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He has no active appeals, having waived those rights as part of his guilty plea. He has reportedly participated in religious study groups in prison and corresponded with a small number of family members. The case has remained a fixture of documentary programming, with Netflix, Lifetime, and Fox all producing detailed treatments. Shanann's parents have continued to speak publicly about the impact on their family. In the Watts case, the confession came within days, and the sentencing was rapid. On a stretch of interstate in Illinois, a very different kind of case was already more than a decade older. And the man at the center never confessed. He has never wavered from his story. And nearly 2 decades later, he remains, among these cases, the one whose conviction is still contested by those who believe him. Christopher Vaughn. On a Thursday morning in June of 2007, a family of 5 was supposed to be on their way to a water park in central Illinois. They never made it. Their red sport utility vehicle was found on a frontage road just off Interstate 55. And by the time first responders arrived, 4 members of the family were beyond help. The father, Christopher Vaughn, was alive, wounded in the wrist and the leg. He gave a very specific account of what had happened inside that vehicle. Investigators did not believe him then. A jury did not believe him later. And yet, nearly 20 years on, a small circle of advocates are still fighting to overturn what happened in that courtroom. Christopher Vaughn was 32 years old at the time of the events. He worked in the private security industry and lived with his family in Oswego, Illinois, a suburban community southwest of Chicago. His wife, Kimberly, was 34. Their 3 children lived at home. Neighbors described a family that appeared ordinary, involved in local activities, and unremarkable. That surface would begin to look different in the months and weeks before the events, as friends and co-workers later described a version of Christopher Vaughn, who had grown restless, distant, and increasingly interested in disappearing from the life he had built. In the days leading up to the 14th of June, Vaughn had been researching the Yukon Territory in Canada. He had been visiting adult entertainment clubs. He had spent thousands of dollars on the side. He appeared, in the account prosecutors would later present, to be preparing for a life he could not have while married with 3 children. On the morning of the 14th of June, 2007, the family left their home in Oswego with the stated plan of driving to Springfield to visit a water park. Vaughn was driving. Kimberly was in the front passenger seat. The 3 children were in the back. At some point in the drive, Vaughn pulled the vehicle off the interstate and onto a frontage road. Within a short window of time, all 4 other members of the family lost their lives inside the vehicle. Vaughn walked away from the sport utility vehicle, flagged down a passing driver, and reported that he had been wounded. He gave a specific account. He said that Kimberly had produced a firearm inside the car, had harmed the 3 children fatally, had wounded him in the wrist and the leg, and had then ended her own life. The account did not survive its first day. Forensic examiners studied the blood patterns inside the vehicle, the position of the firearm, the trajectory of the wounds, and the wounds to Vaughn himself. Their conclusions did not match his story. The wounds to Vaughn were described as consistent with self-infliction. The position of the weapon and the physical evidence inside the vehicle indicated a different sequence of events than the one he described. Investigators also examined the days and weeks leading up to the drive. They found evidence of the Yukon research, the club visits, the unexplained cash withdrawals, and communications suggesting Vaughn had been quietly building the outline of a new life outside of the marriage. The theory prosecutors would present at trial was that Vaughn had planned to walk away from his family and had chosen a route that would leave no one behind to complicate his exit. Was this a father who lost his family, or a man who wrote a story he hoped a jury might accept? The trial took place in the late summer and early fall of 2012 in Will County, Illinois. The case ran alongside the equally high-profile trial of former police officer Drew Peterson, which drew significant Chicago area media attention. In September of 2012, after less than an hour of deliberation, the jury convicted Vaughn on 4 counts of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing on the 26th of November, 2012, Judge Daniel Rozak imposed 4 consecutive natural life sentences. Illinois had by then abolished the death penalty, so life in prison without the possibility of parole was the maximum available sanction. Vaughn's direct appeals were exhausted by the middle of the following decade. An Illinois appellate court affirmed the conviction in 2015. The Illinois Supreme Court declined to review the case. However, Vaughn's parents, along with the Innocence Advocacy Group investigating Innocence and attorney Keith Altman, have continued to press public and legal campaigns arguing that the original account should be revisited. In 2024, a federal judge sanctioned Altman $500 over a civil filing that the court found had no foundation in the law. As of the writing of this account, Christopher Vaughn is held at Pinckneyville Correctional Center in southern Illinois. He is not eligible for parole. His direct appeals are exhausted. He continues to publicly maintain the account he gave on the frontage road in June of 2007. Of all the cases in this account, his conviction remains the most actively contested by outside advocates. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Chase Merritt. On the 4th of February, 2010, the McStay family walked out of their home in Fallbrook, California, and for nearly 4 years, no one on earth knew where they were. The lights had been left on. Groceries sat unopened on the kitchen counter. Bowls of popcorn were still sitting where they had been left the night before. The family's 2 dogs had been left in the yard, and yet the front door was closed. The family car was gone, and Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons were nowhere to be found. Joseph McStay was 40 years old at the time of the events. He owned a small business called Earth-Inspired Products, which sold custom indoor water fountains through an online catalog and to commercial clients. His wife Summer was 43. Their 2 young sons lived with them in the North San Diego County community of Fallbrook. To their family, friends, and business contacts, the McStays looked like a family in the middle of an ordinary life. Joseph had a business partner named Charles Merritt, known to nearly everyone as Chase, who handled the construction side of the fountains. Merritt was a welder and metalworker in his early 50s, financially stretched, and had known Joseph for years. The last day the family was seen in public was the 4th of February, 2010. Joseph and Merritt had spoken on the phone that afternoon. According to prosecutors, Joseph had told Merritt during a meeting 3 days earlier that Merritt owed him roughly $42,000 in disputed business funds, and that Merritt was being cut out of the fountain business. That evening, some hours after that conversation, all 4 members of the McStay family were harmed fatally at their home in Fallbrook. When family members began calling in the days that followed, no one answered. Joseph's brother eventually entered the home and found it in the state that would define the case for years afterward. The Isuzu Trooper the family drove was later found abandoned near the San Isidro border crossing into Mexico. On surveillance footage, 4 figures believed to be the McStays were seen walking toward the border on the night of the 8th of February. For nearly 4 years, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department pursued the theory that the McStays had chosen to disappear into Mexico voluntarily. That theory ended in mid-November of 2013. An off-road motorcyclist riding through the Mojave Desert near Victorville in San Bernardino County discovered shallow graves. The remains were identified through dental records and DNA. All 4 members of the McStay family were recovered from that site. Cause of death for the family was ruled blunt force head trauma. The case shifted to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, and attention turned back to Chase Merritt. Investigators found a 3-pound sledgehammer at the gravesite. They also found Merritt's DNA on the steering wheel and gear shift of the Isuzu Trooper, despite his statements to detectives that he had never driven the vehicle. Cell tower data placed him near the burial site in the days after the disappearance. And QuickBooks records showed that Merritt had cashed and backdated checks from Joseph's business account and had contacted the QuickBooks helpline while impersonating Joseph. Why does a business partner cash his friend's checks, delete records in his friend's name, and drive his friend's vehicle to the border, all while telling investigators he has done nothing at all? Chase Merritt was arrested on the 5th of November, 2014. His trial did not begin until the winter of 2019, following years of delays and multiple changes in his legal representation, including a period during which he represented himself. On the 10th of June, 2019, a San Bernardino County jury convicted him on 4 counts of first-degree murder, with a multiple murder special circumstance finding. At sentencing, on the 21st of January, 2020, Judge Michael A. Smith imposed a death sentence for the losses of Summer and the 2 young sons. For Joseph, Merritt received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Merritt has continued to publicly maintain his innocence. His attorneys have signaled an intent to raise claims of prosecutorial misconduct and ineffective assistance of counsel on appeal. As of the writing of this account, Chase Merritt is held at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in Otay Mesa, San Diego, having been transferred out of San Quentin under California's Condemned Inmate Transfer Program. His automatic direct appeal to the California Supreme Court remains pending. California has been under an executions moratorium since 2019, and no execution date exists for him. The author Caitlin Rother published a book in 2025 raising questions about the evidentiary strength of the conviction. The case, despite the guilty verdict, continues to draw scrutiny from writers and researchers. The McStay case was defined by absence. What follows is defined by presence of the most disturbing kind. 9 members of a single household in Fresno, California, were found together in a single room in the back of a house that neighbors had walked past for years without knowing what was happening inside. Marcus Wesson. On the 12th of March, 2004, a small group of relatives arrived at a house in Fresno, California, to reclaim children they said had been taken from them. Within minutes, the front yard was surrounded by police cars, responding to a custody dispute. Within an hour, the man who ran the household inside emerged from the front door covered in blood. And when officers entered the home, they discovered 9 members of the same household piled together in a single back bedroom. It would take investigators years to fully understand what had been happening inside that house, and what the man who ran it had built there over the course of decades. Marcus Wesson was 57 years old at the time of the events. He had spent most of his adult life constructing and controlling a large household made up of his wife, his daughters, and several of his nieces. The household had moved multiple times over the years, living for periods on boats, in remote properties, and finally in a residence in central Fresno. Wesson had convinced the people around him that he was a spiritual figure of unique importance, that ordinary rules of family and biology did not apply inside the household, and that outsiders, including the mothers of some of the nieces, were enemies to be resisted. Over the years, he had fathered children through incestuous relationships with his own daughters and nieces. 9 of those children lived in the Fresno home at the time of the events. On the 12th of March, 2004, 2 of the nieces who had left the household some time earlier arrived at the front of the home, along with other family members, seeking to reclaim their own children who remained inside. A confrontation began on the porch. Police were called. Wesson went back into the house and closed the door. What followed was a standoff that lasted a little over an hour. When Wesson finally walked out of the front door, he was covered in blood and surrendered without resistance. Officers entering the home discovered 9 members of the household in a back bedroom, all harmed fatally by the same firearm, which was found nearby. The investigation that followed uncovered decades of context. Officers spoke with former members of the household and with relatives who had spent years trying to extract children from Wesson's orbit. Prosecutors would later describe him as a master manipulator, a man who had used a private theology of his own invention to control the family around him. Notably, forensic testing did not place gunshot residue on Wesson's own hands. The defense would later argue that one of his daughters had been responsible for the deaths and had ended her own life last. Prosecutors argued that Wesson had orchestrated the events, whether or not he had personally handled the firearm. What does it take for one man, over the course of decades, to build a household so isolated from the outside world that 9 members of it can be lost together in a single room without anyone outside knowing? The case went to trial in Fresno County in early 2005. The jury deliberated at length. On the 17th of June, 2005, Marcus Wesson was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with 14 additional counts related to sex crimes against underage members of the household. The jury's verdict did not require a finding that Wesson had personally handled the firearm. At sentencing, on the 27th of June, 2005, the trial court imposed a death sentence. Wesson's direct appeals have been denied by the California Supreme Court. His convictions and his sentence remain in place. As of the writing of this account, Marcus Wesson is in his late 70s and is held in the California state prison system. Under the California moratorium on executions, in place since 2019, no execution date has been set. As part of the ongoing dismantling of the former death row at San Quentin State Prison, condemned inmates in California have been transferred into the general prison system. The case is often cited alongside cult and coercive control cases and remains one of the largest single household losses in the state's history. In the Wesson case, the household had been closed off from the outside for decades. What comes next begins with an errand at a supermarket in Cheshire, Connecticut. The Petit family did not know either of the 2 men who watched them push a cart through the produce section that afternoon. By the following morning, one of the most closely watched cases in modern American legal history had begun. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky. The Petit family did not know either of the men who would arrive at their door. On the 23rd of July, 2007, Jennifer Hawk Petit and her younger daughter were shopping at a supermarket in Cheshire, Connecticut. Standing near the produce section, a man watched them, followed them out to their car, and made note of the direction they drove home. He then drove back to a motel where his accomplice was waiting. Later that same night, both men walked into the Petit family home. What followed became a defining case in the American debate over the death penalty, and one of the most difficult cases many of its investigators would ever handle. Dr. William Petit was an endocrinologist in Cheshire, a small residential town in central Connecticut. His wife, Jennifer Hawk Petit, was 48 years old and worked in the medical field. Their 2 daughters lived at home. The family was well known in Cheshire and active in local community and church life. Neither Jennifer nor Dr. Petit had ever met the 2 men who would arrive at their door. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky were paroled burglars. Both had extensive prior records. Both had been released from prison shortly before the events, and both were considered by parole authorities to be at high risk of reoffending. Komisarjevsky had been out of prison for months. Hayes had recently been released from a halfway house program. They had connected through the parole system. On the afternoon of the 23rd of July, Komisarjevsky spotted Jennifer and her younger daughter at a Stop-and-Shop supermarket in Cheshire. He followed them home. Later that evening, he returned with Hayes. The two men entered the family home in the early hours of the 24th of July. Dr. Petit was restrained in the basement after being beaten. Jennifer and the two daughters were held upstairs for several hours. In the morning, Hayes drove Jennifer to a nearby branch of the Bank of America. She was instructed to withdraw $15,000 from a line of credit and told that her family would be harmed if she did not comply, or if she alerted anyone. Inside the bank, she managed to inform the branch manager of what was happening. The branch manager called 911 from the branch. Officers were dispatched. Hayes drove Jennifer back to the family home. In the minutes that followed, both intruders left the house, which had been doused in accelerant and set on fire. Jennifer and both of her daughters lost their lives inside the home. Dr. William Petit, badly injured, managed to escape from the basement and reach a neighbor's house. Police officers who had been dispatched to the Petit home in response to the bank manager's call arrived in time to see the two men attempting to flee. Hayes and Komisarjevsky were arrested within minutes of leaving the driveway. Both were injured in the crash of the Petit family's vehicle. Both were taken into custody at the scene. The investigation that followed centered on the parole history of both men, on the sequence of events inside the home, and on the ongoing survival and testimony of Dr. Petit. Both men were quickly linked to the events through physical evidence, surveillance footage, and their own statements to detectives. What happens when the worst fear a family carries, the stranger in the parking lot, the follow home from a supermarket, actually walks through the front door? Hayes went to trial first. In October of 2010, a New Haven County jury convicted him on multiple counts, including capital felony. He was sentenced to death. Komisarjevsky's trial followed. He was convicted in 2011 and was sentenced to death in 2012. Both direct appeals were rejected on the merits by the Connecticut Supreme Court. In 2015, following the Connecticut legislature's earlier abolition of the death penalty for future cases, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that no existing death sentences could be carried out under the state's remaining law. Both Hayes and Komisarjevsky were resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Komisarjevsky received 6 consecutive life terms. Dr. William Petit later became a Connecticut state representative and remains a public figure in the state. He remarried and has continued to speak about the case and about victims' rights. As of the writing of this account, Joshua Komisarjevsky remains incarcerated in the Connecticut Department of Correction, serving life without the possibility of parole. Stephen Hayes has since publicly identified as a transgender woman, using the name Linda Mai Lee. Following a series of prison transfers, she is currently held at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, having granted an interview to Newsweek in January of 2025. The Petit case unfolded in the space of a single night. From the parking lot of a supermarket to the smoke over a Cheshire street the following morning. On a rural property in Arkansas, 20 years earlier, a very different kind of case ran on a very different clock. It unfolded over the course of nearly a full week in the same house, without a single relative, neighbor, or delivery driver realizing anything was wrong. Ronald Gene Simmons. In December of 1987, a retired Air Force serviceman named Ronald Gene Simmons Sr. began a series of events at a rural property in Dover, Arkansas, that ended with the largest family-related loss of life in the state's history. It did not happen in a single night. It unfolded across nearly a full week, inside the same house, without a single relative, delivery driver, or neighbor realizing anything was wrong. By the time investigators fully understood what had happened, 16 people were beyond help, 14 of them members of his own family. And Simmons himself had walked into a business in the nearby town of Russellville and turned himself in. Simmons was in his late 40s at the time of the events. He had spent decades in the United States Air Force before retiring. He had moved his family through several states before settling on a rural property in Pope County, Arkansas, known locally as Mockingbird Hill. His wife, Rebecca, known to family as Becky, was 46 years old. Together, they had raised a large family. Several adult children remained close to the household. Others had moved out of state and were expected to return to the property for the Christmas holiday. Neighbors of the Simmons property later described a household that was unusually isolated, even by rural standards. Family members had been made to dig a large pit on the property in the months leading up to December. Simmons had described the pit to relatives as being for household waste. The events at Mockingbird Hill began on the 22nd of December, 1987. Over the course of the following 6 days, all 14 family members present at the property lost their lives, in a sequence that included his wife, one of his adult sons, several of his younger children who returned home from school, and members of extended family who arrived at the property during the Christmas holiday expecting a family gathering. The pit dug earlier that year became part of the scene at the property. On the 28th of December, Simmons drove into the nearby town of Russellville. He entered several businesses in a single morning, including a law office and a convenience store, and used a firearm to harm 6 additional people, 2 of whom lost their lives. One of those 2 was an office manager named Joyce Butts. He then sat down inside one of the businesses and asked staff to call the police. When officers arrived, he surrendered without resistance and told them, in language later recorded in official reports, that he had already dealt with everyone who had ever wanted to hurt him. Officers dispatched to Mockingbird Hill discovered the scale of what had happened at the property. Because the events had unfolded across multiple days and involved family members who had arrived at the property at different times, prosecutors would later charge Simmons in 2 separate proceedings, one for the events in Russellville and one for the events at the property in Dover. What allows the loss of an entire family, spread across nearly a week and multiple arrivals, to take place inside a single household without a single relative, neighbor, or delivery driver realizing anything at all? Simmons was convicted in both proceedings. On the 10th of February, 1989, he was sentenced to death. He took the unusual step of instructing his attorneys to waive all of his appeals. He publicly stated that he wanted his sentence to be carried out as quickly as possible. Another Arkansas death row prisoner, Jonas Whitmore, filed a legal challenge attempting to prevent Simmons's execution from moving forward on constitutional grounds. That challenge, which reached the United States Supreme Court under the name Whitmore versus Arkansas, was ultimately unsuccessful. On the 25th of June, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr. was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit of the Arkansas Department of Correction. The death warrant had been signed by then-Governor Bill Clinton. Simmons was the first individual to be executed by lethal injection in the state of Arkansas. His execution followed by 1 week the electrocution of a separate condemned prisoner named John Edward Swindler, which had taken place on the 18th of June, 1990. As of the writing of this account, Simmons is deceased. The Mockingbird Hill property and the case itself remain fixtures in Arkansas legal and journalistic history. The Simmons case ended in an execution barely 18 months after the events. The final case in this account ran on a much longer clock. A father in New Jersey walked out of his family home in November of 1971. And it would take a nationally broadcast television program, a forensic sculptor, and 18 years of ordinary life under a false name before anyone caught up with him. John Emil List. On the 9th of November, 1971, an accountant named John Emil List walked into his kitchen in Westfield, New Jersey, and over the course of the day, ended the lives of everyone in his household. He then made himself a sandwich, turned off most of the lights in the house, arranged the bodies of his family in the ballroom on the second floor, wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor explaining what he had done, and quietly left town. It would be nearly a month before anyone realized his family was gone, and it would be nearly 18 years before anyone realized where he had gone. John Emil List was 46 years old at the time of the events. He worked as an accountant, had served in the United States Army during the Second World War, and identified strongly with a strict form of Lutheran faith. He lived in a large 19-room home in Westfield with his mother, his wife Helen, and their 3 children. Helen was in her mid-40s. His mother, Alma, was in her mid-80s and lived in an upper-floor apartment inside the home. For years, List had been quietly hiding a severe financial crisis from his family. He had been dismissed from a series of accounting positions and had drained his mother's savings to cover the family's expenses. Neighbors and members of his church had no idea. To outsiders, he was a devout family man in a large Victorian house. To himself, by his own account written that day, he was a man convinced he could no longer support his family, and in a stated religious rationalization, that he could still preserve their souls if he acted before their circumstances further deteriorated. On the 9th of November, 1971, List began early in the day. His wife Helen was harmed fatally in the kitchen. His mother Alma was harmed fatally in her upstairs apartment. As the children returned from school through the afternoon, each was met individually. All members of the household lost their lives that day. Afterward, List arranged the bodies on sleeping bags in the home's ballroom. He wrote the 5-page letter to his pastor, describing his reasoning and asking that the letter be read after his family had been discovered. He cut his own face out of every family photograph in the home. He set the intercom system to play religious music continuously. He canceled the family's mail, milk, and newspaper deliveries so that no one would notice their absence. And he drove to Kennedy Airport, left his car there, and disappeared. The bodies were discovered on the 7th of December, 1971, nearly a month after the events, when a neighbor became concerned that the lights in the home, which had been left on, were beginning to burn out. Police entered the home to the sound of religious music still playing over the intercom. The letter to the pastor was found where List had left it. He had been gone for weeks. Investigators had no lead on his location. For nearly 18 years, they had none. List had reappeared in Colorado and later in Virginia under the name Robert P. Clark. He worked in accounting, remarried a woman who had no idea about his history, attended church regularly, and lived quietly as a middle-aged man, building a second life. The investigation had never closed, but it had gone effectively cold. What allows a man to end the lives of 5 members of his own household, write a letter to his pastor about it, and then live openly under a different name for nearly 2 decades? On the 21st of May, 1989, the television program America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the List case. A forensic sculptor named Frank Bender produced an age-progressed clay bust showing what List might look like nearly 2 decades later. The bust was broadcast on the program, along with details of the case. Within days, a viewer in Virginia recognized the man in the bust as her neighbor. On the 1st of June, 1989, John List was arrested outside his workplace in Virginia. He initially identified himself as Robert Clark, but was quickly confirmed as List through fingerprint records. His trial began the following year in New Jersey. On the 12th of April, 1990, a Union County jury convicted him on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive terms of life in prison. List spent the remaining years of his life in the New Jersey state prison system. He gave a small number of interviews, including one on ABC's 2020, in which he continued to express what he described as regret. He never denied the events. He did not appeal his conviction. As of the writing of this account, John Emil List is deceased. He passed away on the 21st of March, 2008, at the age of 82, at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. The cause of death was recorded as pneumonia. The Westfield home in which the events took place burned down under separate circumstances in 1972. The property was later cleared, and a new home was built on the site. 10 households, 10 outcomes, 10 legal records still on the books. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.